Okay, well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday, and we're going to, of course, start out as per usual with the news of the week. And the news this week is there are a couple of states out there that are considering legislation that's going to be promoting solar and wind to a certain extent. For instance, Vermont House Bill 320 prioritizes new installations of solar. I just realized I need to jump into the speaker view here. There we go. And anyway, so what they found is the old systems, the old, if you have existing renewable energy systems, they're not meeting the targets. So what they're trying to do is encourage the development of new systems. So for instance, the state of Vermont has now said that as of 2030, you've got to have 20% of all of the renewable energy that's being generated from new wind and solar. By 2035, it's got to be 30%. 80% of all of the renewable energy being used within Vermont has to come from the New England region. So they're trying to localize renewable energy in that regard. And then 40% is the cap for existing resources to be utilized. So essentially, over the next decade or so, 60% of all of the renewable energy has to be newly developed. So that's where they're coming from there. Georgia, the state of Georgia is considering a bill, Senate Bill 210, which is looking to expand community solar. Community solar is, for those of you who don't remember, is when you don't install the system directly on your home, but you buy into a larger system. So there might be a 20-acre solar array and you've bought 15 panels in that system, and then it's allocated to your location. Well, they've expanded community solar into the nonprofit and governmental sphere. So these nonprofit agencies can then aggregate their electrical consumption and meet it through community solar, through solar that's located off-site. They've also allowed commercial systems now, commercial entities, to install up to 125% of their demand. So that gives them a little more leeway rather than just going to the 100%. They've increased the maximum size of residential systems from 10 kilowatts to 15 kilowatts before it is considered commercial. And they've raised the cap for net metering. The cap in Georgia was very, very low. It was 0.2% penetration before they would change the net metering laws. Now they've raised it up to 5%. In exchange for all of this, they're allowing the utilities to charge $20 a month as an access fee minimum for those people who have solar. There was an interesting development in New Jersey where a brownfield was developed into solar. And this is something that the Inflation Reduction Act is trying to promote with a 10% increased tax credit. But rather than taking pristine farmland or vacant land and turning it into solar, we want to take these polluted sites. This particular site was an abandoned paper mill. It was abandoned back in the 1990s, and it was actually an EPA Superfund site. And they put a 17 kilowatt solar array on this system. It was developed by a partnership of CEP Renewables and NJR Clean Energy Ventures. Now, Clean Energy Ventures is the largest owner-operator of solar within the state of New Jersey. They have about 430 megawatts of installed capacity within their portfolio, located in New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. And this one was kind of cool. Swap Robotics just received a seed money grant, about $7 million, to perfect and continue to develop and bring to market a 100% solar robot that is used in this instance for clearing vegetation around solar arrays. This is geared towards the commercial and the utility scale market. But this thing, the first time it runs, it maps out the site. Then from that point on, it can run pretty much autonomously. It can swap out its battery system within 5 minutes, can run 24/7 if you want it to, I guess. There is remote monitoring of it. And you might think this is not a big deal, but studies have shown that vegetation maintenance of solar arrays is the largest single expense for ongoing maintenance and operation of these arrays. And in fact, it's projected that by 2040, it will be a $50 billion industry clearing the vegetation around these solar arrays. And I could see this particular product being used for a lot of different things, golf courses, whatever. So that's kind of an interesting new technology that's on the horizon. And there was a recent study by NREL that found that climate change, not only is it changing the world, but it's beginning to adversely affect how much production solar and wind, how much those systems are producing. In fact, they found that those systems that have been installed since 2015 are actually producing about 8% less than originally forecast. And the reason for this is that the data that we use when we get it through PV Watts or someplace like that is based on historical data. And we're beginning now to see that that data is changing. Because of climate change, we're getting more erratic weather patterns. You're getting higher temperatures in locations than have been historically the case, which is going to reduce the output. And if you get less rain, you get more dust, which begins to increase and lower the output of the system. Now, in this study, they found that there are going to be winners and losers. The losers are going to be those places that historically have been good for installation of solar, like California, the desert Southwest. You're going to see a lot more clouds out there in the desert Southwest, less production, whereas places like the Midwest, Europe, those kind of places are actually going to benefit. You're talking about real money here. This particular case study was showing that they're anticipating, when you sell at the utility scale, you're selling power purchase agreements. If you get 8% less production, it can literally cost millions and millions of dollars. So that's going to be a big issue with solar in the future. And I think just from a practical standpoint, you're probably going to want to anticipate some of this when you're doing your predictions as far as how much will be generated over the coming years. So perhaps derate, even put a climate change derate factor into your calculations. All right, well, that's the news. Does anybody have anything they want to add to that, or any comments that they might have regarding the news from this week? Give you just a second to respond there. Okay, I'm not hearing any. So anyway, the topic that I thought we would touch on this week was there was a very interesting podcast that I listened to, and I heard there's a Factor This podcast that talked about Toledo Solar. And then Renvu just had a webinar that featured Toledo Solar. So there's a lot of discussion out there. And so the takeaway that I had from this, and that I thought we should share a bit, is thin film versus silicon. It appears at least based on what I've heard recently, that everything we knew about this stuff has changed. When we looked at traditional solar panels, there was monocrystalline panels, which are sort of the premium, they're the best. Then there's polysilicon, a little bit less as far as production, a little bit less as far as price. And then thin film, which was considered to be the low end quality. It's going to be lower price, but lower production, will not last as long. So that's the narrative that I've been teaching, that I've understood for many, many years. In fact, I always like to joke that thin film was the Harbor Freight of solar panels. And while you still can get thin film at Harbor Freight, I think some of the realities, especially of cadmium telluride solar, have changed. So let's jump into that a little bit. There are a number of different kinds of thin film. So I think whoops, I thought I had a close-up on that. Nope. Anyway, so there's cadmium telluride, which we'll go into a little bit more depth there. That's the chemical composition that First Solar and Toledo Solar use in the manufacturing of their products. Then there's CIGS, and CIGS stands for, it's a complicated name. It actually stands for copper, I can't read my own writing, indium, gallium, selenide. Anyway, it has some factors that make it acceptable, but it does only have about a 2% market penetration. Cadmium telluride is at about 5%, 5.1%. And when you start looking at the price per watt, cadmium telluride is about 40 cents, at least according to what I've seen in industry press. CIGS is a little bit more expensive, about 60 cents per watt. Then you get into amorphous silicon, and amorphous silicon has some good applications. Oh, I should say SIG is supposed to be good with low temperatures, low light. So oftentimes they use it in space applications, aerospace applications. Amorphous silicon, that's going to be a little more expensive, about 69 cents a watt. And it, again, also has about 2% market penetration. And there are a number of other ones. Perovskite's not it is an amorphous process, but it's still in the theoretical stages. There was another one, gallium arsenide, which is again in an experimental phase. So we're seeing other technologies being developed, but they haven't had much market penetration. So at this point, really the thin film is going to be the cadmium telluride, the CIGS, and the amorphous silicon. When you compare that with silicon itself, crystalline silicon, the price for that is about 24 cents per kilowatt hour, and it currently has about 90% of the market share. So thin film is still, and also ran, but I think what we're going to be seeing, and part of the purpose of this particular discussion, is we're going to start seeing serious inroads into the residential and commercial marketplace from this thin film technology. Already in the United States, thin film has taken about 40 to 50% of the utility scale solar. So when you see those large solar arrays being developed out there, they are thin film. The two major players in this marketplace, First Solar is the big dog, and then Toledo Solar is sort of a smaller spin-off of that same technology. And it's kind of interesting because both of these companies are located up around Toledo, Ohio. And actually, when you talk about solar panel manufacturing, China, far and away #1 in the world for solar panel manufacturing. In second place is Toledo, Ohio. More than any other country. Toledo, Ohio is #2 in the world in solar manufacturing. And it's largely because of First Solar. Toledo Solar is coming in behind. First Solar has exclusively been marketing to utility scale systems. Toledo Solar is using the same kind of technology, but now is going to be marketing to commercial and residential systems. So Toledo Solar is the one that you'll probably be dealing with unless you're doing large utility scale systems. So what are some of the advantages of this kind of technology? Well, one of the advantages, which is a big advantage at the moment, is it's 100% made in the US. So you're beginning to, as people take advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act, you're going to see that 10% tax credit for US product. Well, Toledo Solar, First Solar, you automatically meet it. All of the component pieces are US made. You might have a panel manufacturer that's assembling solar panels in the United States, But where did the silicon come from? Where did the chips, where did the cells come from? That's what the IRS is going to start looking at to determine, is it in fact US manufactured? The final assembly, that may not be the factor. It does absorb at a wider bandwidth, a wider spectrum of light. So what that means is it can absorb energy more effectively over a longer period of the day. So in low light mornings, low light evenings, you're getting more cloud cover. You're going to get some of the UV absorbed. So you're going to get more production there. I guess sort of as a template to lay over this, what they're arguing, the people who manufacture these panels, and clearly the utility scale industry has agreed, is that you can't just go by the nameplate capacity. When you say it's this much efficiency and it's this much production under peak energy conditions, under standard test conditions, you've got to see what is actual performance in the real world given these increasingly marginal weather conditions where they're operating. Now, First Solar and Toledo Solar were argued that they've got hard data that their panels are 8 to 10% more productive right off the bat than a comparable silicon panel. There is also less degrading over time. So one of the things that we'd always talked about is these things have low short-term warranties because they're not as robust. Well, again, now First Solar and Toledo Solar are saying, no, that it's exactly the opposite. Our solar panels will not degrade. And to back that up, they're offering a 30-year warranty on their solar panels. And they say that at 30 years, it will still produce 90% of what it did when you installed it under that warranty. So that's far and away the best warranty that's out there in the marketplace. Normally we see, something like a 25-year warranty, and at the end of 25 years, it might produce 82 to 85%. So it's a better warranty. They're saying less degrading over time, which means more production over the life of that panel. The panels also are flat black. So as far as attractive nature, there's none of the cell distinctions that you might see or the variations in color that you might see in a polysilicon. But they're also very, very thin. They're frameless. These are glass on glass solar panels. And so rather than a 35 millimeter thick panel with the frame, you're looking at about a 6 millimeter thick solar panel. So they claim about the size, the thickness of your cell phone, unless you have an old flip phone, then I guess that's 35 millimeters. And they also have very high voltage versus amps. So you can get by with much smaller wire. Now, this is a double-edged sword, which I'll point out here in just a second, because that voltage can cause you some problems when we get into rapid shutdown. So as I mentioned before, about 40 to 50% of the utility scale solar installed in the US is cadmium telluride. So it does have a history. It is a tested and tried and true technology. Toledo Solar, again, as I mentioned, is getting into the residential and the commercial marketplace, but this is also now a commercially available thin, transparent technology. I've talked before about perovskite being an option for transparent windows, solar signage. Well, cadmium telluride already is there. So we can begin to see true solar windows being marketed. And according to the sales guy, and of course he's a sales guy, so what do you expect? He's saying that this product from Toledo Solar is going to be on the market very, very soon. There is the concern. I wanted to give the positives, now some of the negatives. Slightly higher cost, although they would argue that over the life of based on production, it's not. In fact, they will argue that it's lower cost. They are higher voltage. So the higher voltage can cause some significant problems when you're talking about complying with rapid shutdown. For a ground-mounted system, not a problem. But you're limited within the rapid shutdown provisions of the NEC that within the solar array, you cannot exceed 80 volts. Well, some of these panels are 90 some volts output from the panel itself. That on its face would violate the rapid shutdown provision. How many could you put in a string? Well, problematic. You'd have to be hooking them specifically into power, some sort of module level power electronic. So that can be an issue. And then you've got the problem of convincing skeptical folks that in fact it will have higher output. They provided, they said, Toledo Solar, the sales guy, said they will do an analysis amongst for one panel versus their panel, over the lifetime. So I pulled this up from their documentation, and they're claiming, I think this is comparing a 5 kW system with another 5 kW system. That would be my guess based on some of these numbers. They're saying that the output in the first 12 months from the Toledo Solar panel, 7,200 kilowatt hours, versus the Jinko Solar of 6,083. So that would be actual production for comparably 5 kW systems. The initial cost after the incentives, well, we can ignore that, but the initial project cost, the installed cost, they're showing 17,000 versus 20,000. If it is a 5 kW system, they paid a lot per watt for that system. The payback periods, they're showing, of course, you get better. And the size required, 500 feet versus 600 feet, 600 square feet for that system. And when they talk about generated capacity per square foot over the lifetime of that system, they're really projecting, gosh, it looks like about a 50% bonus from their panel. So I guess the problem is convincing skeptical people like me that those are true numbers, so it's like you'll have to convince me. That's definitely a problem for them. I also thought it would be interesting because since Toledo Solar is the only one that's going to be marketing these to commercial and residential, to look at some of the panel specs. And in this case, you will see the first thing that really jumped out to me, that their product line only includes a 105 watt panel, 110 watt panel, 115 and 120. Now we've been used to with these silicon panels being 400 watts, 350. I mean, they're getting up to 600 watts. And so now Toledo Solar's coming out with, in my mind, kind of dinky little panels, 120 watts. They also have very high voltages. You can see there that it's going to be about 78 volts for the VOC, but only about 2 amps, basically. So you can get by with very small wire. Where it comes into, when you look at the mechanicals, they are small panels. It's basically 2 foot by 4 foot. So that's significantly smaller than a silicon panel. Now, they would argue that that makes installation quite easy. One person can manage these panels. So that's something to consider. They only weigh 26 pounds. So again, but the time involved is going to increase because you're having to put in more and more of those panels. So I found that kind of interesting. There were also some compatibility issues. They are not compatible with N-phase microinverters. So that's going to be a significant problem. They're trying to direct people to the Generac microinverters, which they are compatible with. But since N-phase has about a 40% market share of the residential market, I mean, they're going to have to overcome that. They are compatible with Solar Edge. So those of you who love Solar Edge, that's an issue. Let me see if there's, they do offer end of life recycling. So that's something that First Solar has been doing. So it's when you purchase the panel from them, when you're done with it, if you get rid of it, they'll take care of it. Now, whether they'll be doing that in 30 years when you're really done with the panel, remains to be seen. I think that was pretty much. Oh, I didn't mention about the low energy footprint for these solar panels. And this is, again, going to be relatively significant because with silicon panels, you take silicon and melt it. So to make essentially the cells, that's a significant amount of energy that's required to manufacture solar panels. It's labor intensive. It is energy intensive to make these solar panels. The thin film technology is more like an inkjet kind of technology. So there is a very substantially less labor and substantially less energy to put those in. And in fact, because of that, there are projections out there that this kind of technology is going to see exponential price declines because there's not that much involved in the actual fixed costs of doing this kind of production. So that is what I had. Does anybody have any questions for the good of the cause? Throw it open.
Jay, I was actually looking at those thin film type modules for use in a agrivoltaic field, simply because of the environment, and also I understand they're a bit translucent as well in most cases, which allows some filtering of sunlight to be used. But definitely something I had to follow up because it's something I'm doing in Trinidad on some projects. And I think that might be a better way to go than using standard silicon-based PV modules.
Yeah, I think you may be right. I know you asked last week about translucent solar panels, and here's one that will allow vegetative growth underneath. Or I could see solar canopies where you want to shade, but you don't want to get rid of all of the sunshine, so there's a lot of applications for it. Okay.
What would be the robustness of that panel at 6 millimeters? That's really thin.
Yeah, it is really thin.
You would think handling that would be, well, I guess it's a smaller panel too, so it might not be.
It does require proprietary clamps, but it will, those clamps, the mid clamps and the end clamps, will work with traditional racking systems. So you could use Unirack, you can use Iron Ridge, but it has to have those clamps. Now, they were talking about the wind shear factor and all of that. They're supposed to be robust, right? They're a double glass thing. I don't know how they'd stand up to hail. I assume they will. But when you talk about wind load, it will actually reduce the wind load because, there's less of a profile for the wind to hit. They seem to be pretty robust. I mean, there's a lot of them out there. So
I get to see that getting a half decent snowstorm somewhere, getting some ice on top of it at 6 millimeters. Some of that ice can get really heavy.
Yeah.
So,
well, they are guaranteed. They're guaranteed for like 15 years for the manufacturing capacity there. Yeah, I don't know. That's something to bring up. But one of the challenges that we've seen with solar panels in the development is the balance of systems cost. Solar panels, we can get the silicon price down and down and down, but the price of aluminum for the framing keeps going up and up and up. So, this may be where we're headed is, making sure that there are less materials in all of our installations. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, Jay, Bruce, can you expand a little bit about that? The problem with the rapid shutdown in the voltage?
Sure. Yeah. Rapid shutdown is the provision within the NEC that says when you shut off the main disconnect for your solar array, that the array has to stop generating power at the array. Well, in the 2017 code, they said that as part of that, you cannot have any more than 80 volts within the array boundary itself when the array is turned off. So if you have a single panel that's generating more than 80 volts, then you're in violation of the rapid shutdown provision. If you've connected two panels together in series, without some sort of electronic device that shuts or disconnects them when the system is turned off, you're also going to be in violation of that particular provision. So they're going to, and that's probably one of the reasons they had their voltage there at 70 something, is to stay under that 80 volt threshold. I don't know why there's the 80 volt threshold within the array itself. The rapid shutdown was to protect firefighters from cutting through live wires when they go into a house and they vent the roof or something like that. But what firefighter is going to cut through a solar panel? It's pretty obvious. But this provision only applies to arrays that are installed on occupied buildings. So ground-mounted systems, this is not an issue. So that may be why, again, it's not an issue for the utility industry. Does that answer your question there, Bruce?
Jay, I also wondered why would the rapid shutdown, right? I understand they want to limit it to 80 volts or less, and they're thinking of that is for safety reasons. But if you have a very large array with a lot of parallel connections, even though you go below 80 volts, wouldn't there still be a danger with high current still circulating in those conductors?
Yeah, well, they would, but what has really effectively happened is as soon as you disconnect the array, then the module level power electronic, which is connected to each of those panels, essentially disconnects the entire system. So you would not be generating anything. And so that's how that works. Now they do allow some voltage because systems like SolarEdge have a 1 volt signal volt that they want to be able to do and test when the grid signal is lost. So there is, but outside of I think it's a 1.5 foot boundary, the voltage has to drop to 30 volts, but within the array itself, it can be up to 80. And I think they did 80 because at the time, most solar panels didn't exceed 40, and they thought, well, 2 of them might be connected in series, so we'll allow for that, but we don't want whole strings that might have a 600 volt, or 1,000 volt in some countries to be live and active once we've disconnected the system.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen some of the larger 500 watt panels being produced now exceeding over 50 volts on the alone, 54 volts.
Yeah, of a panel like that, well, if it's over 50 volts, it would still be all right. But one of these, when it exceeds 80 volts, then you're in trouble because that's what the limit is there. Now, again, ground-mounted systems, not an issue because that rapid shutdown doesn't apply to those. So anybody else have a comment, question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. All right.
Jay, I have a question, but it's unrelated to thin film, so I just want to make sure everybody
Yeah,
is
no,
done
that's
with the
fine.
thin film
That's
related
fine.
questions first.
All right. No, fire away. Somebody else can jump me back.
Okay,
Go ahead,
so the question actually has to do with design. And I have a client who has a quote from one of the door-to-door companies, and they have given them an array design that has everything entirely in landscape. But the problem with it is that they've not maximized the surface area of the roof, and I can fit, if I put it in portrait, I can fit a 9 kilowatt system, whereas the maximum that they can fit with it in landscape is 6.8. So I'm wondering, and they have already inquired that, the client noticed this and they was like, we would like a larger array, please. But the company said we only design in landscape. So I'm wondering, Why that is, I have my theories, but I'm wondering if you have an understanding of why there are companies that only design in landscape.
Yeah, well, I guess my first reaction is that doesn't make any sense because
No, it
it's
doesn't make any
really,
sense at all.
yeah, it's really based on the rafter design of
Right.
of the building. So in a typical home in America, anyway, the rafters are typically going to go from the eave to the peak, in that kind of vertically from the edge of the building up to the top.
Right.
So assuming we're facing south on that roof, it's going to be a north-south orientation. Well,
Mhm.
then your rails typically are going to go east-west,
Right.
which would then mean you're going to have a portrait orientation of your panels.
Right.
But if you have a raster system that is going east-west,
Hmm.
then your rails would go north-south, and then you would have a landscape orientation.
Right.
Yeah. Now,
So I,
there are racking systems that don't follow that guideline. You can get, with north-south rafters, you could end up with north-south rails in theory.
Mhm. Mhm.
But again, why would you would really have to say, how are your rafters before you can say whether it's going to be landscape or portrait.
Well, this is what I've noticed is that the companies that are going to door are using arrays that only go in landscape, and this is not the only client that I've had say this to me. And I've also noticed that people who have used these companies end up ultimately getting these arrays that are in landscape, and then don't use up the majority of the surface area.
Huh.
So this is not like a one-off thing. I think that my theory was that they were buying equipment in bulk, and by doing so, they've really only got one kind of equipment, so they only design one way.
It's possible because, I mean, human nature is, if you install the same thing over and over, you get faster at it and it's
Right.
cheaper.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, but you couldn't count on everybody's rafters being the same.
Right.
That seems somewhat problematic. And the other thing that occurred to me when you were saying that is maybe they're, rather than crossing their rails and supporting them on multiple rafters, they might be going and supporting a single rail on a single rafter, which would be wrong. That would be bad.
Yeah.
So
See, that was the other question I had, is, to me, it doesn't make any sense for load distribution purposes, so the way that I design, I put everything in portrait unless I absolutely have to, like if there's a reason, like if I'm dealing with like a hip roof or some sort of triangular structure or whatever, so it just, to me, seemed very counterintuitive and pretty counterproductive. And I just didn't understand why that was happening. And I guess I still don't understand.
yeah, it does sound counterintuitive. I guess you can come in and just say, well, the reason they didn't do what I do is I'm better at it than they are.
Well, that's true.
So, if that's their only option, it feels like it's a dumb thing to do. But these companies that run around door to door are typically not the best when it
Right.
comes to quality of installation.
So, different question about the same company. The same client read the fine print on the agreement, and this company is laying claim to any future SREC profits.
Yeah.
So, is that normal?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, they're shysters. I mean, that's the bottom line is, yeah, that's where they make a bunch of their money. And we've had some of these discussions before where, they essentially, you're oftentimes just leasing the product from them. So
Yeah.
the cost when you sell the house will go with the cost of the house. And
Yeah.
mostly those are bad decisions when
I know.
it just, I guess, to paraphrase something my dad used to say about life insurance and is solar should be should be bought and not sold.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, if you want solar, go out and get some bids. But if somebody comes to your door and convinces you to buy it, you're probably making a bad decision. You know,
Mhm.
same like with life insurance salesmen. You know, if you want life insurance, go buy it. But if somebody comes to your door and convinces a 16-year-old he needs life insurance, probably not a good idea.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was kind of a news to me that there are
So-
companies that, you know,
What is
lay
the
claim
name of
to
this?
SREC.
What is the name of this company? Because we always like to call them out.
It's
you
Blue.
know.
It's Blue Raven, and
Blue
it's in their
Raven.
fine print. Yes, it's in
Yeah.
their fine print that you know, the consumer assigns any future SREC profits to the company.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you know, unfortunately, we're getting into the world of aluminum siding salesmen who are going out, and we're going to have some bad public relations because
Yeah.
of some of these companies.
Well, I
So-
mean, it may be years away, but these consumers are going to be in a bit of a shock when their solar company lays claim to their SREC
Yeah.
profits.
Well, there have
However
been
many
other-
years that is from now.
Yeah, there have been other incidents where, of course, you know, your contract may have you beginning to pay for the system even before it's operational. And there might be literally years of delay before these companies get around to make it work, and you're paying for it without getting any production. I mean,
Wow.
there's just one after another of these nightmare stories out there from these, you know, salespeople.
Wow. I did not even know that was a thing. Wow.
Mhm. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I know Bob, who's on the call from Chicago. He occasionally likes to rail against these particular companies.
Yeah. So there's a question in the chat about what SREX is, and I'm going to let you explain it because you're better at
Okay.
explaining.
Yeah. And SREC is basically, it only is applicable in a decreasing number of states now. I think only 6 states have SRECs, but it's, think of it like a carbon credit where the state's portfolio standard has said utilities must produce a certain amount of power through renewable energy. Well, if the utility hasn't secured enough of their own production to meet that requirement, or purchased energy from somebody else who's generating it renewably, they can buy an SREC from anybody whose system is connected to the grid. So if I have a system that's producing, say, 1 megawatt hour per month, in some locations, like in Massachusetts, I think SRECs were selling for somewhere around $300 a megawatt hour. So, so my system, I might have $300 times 12, that much value, that it's not from the selling of my electricity. It's just selling the carbon credit essentially to the utility so they don't get fined for not meeting their portfolio requirement. In the state of Ohio, SRECs are currently selling for like $5 a REC, an SREC, a solar renewable energy certificate. So it costs about $100 a year to file the paperwork. So selling an SREC for a residential system doesn't make a lot of sense. But for these large utility scale systems and commercial systems, you can make a substantial amount of money selling SRECs in those states that do have SRECs as a incentive program. Any other questions out there? Let's see. Okay. Well, hearing none, let's just call this meeting to an end, and we'll see you next week, next Tuesday. All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.